Well, I would say that essentially these barriers are best summed up by one word that we talk a lot about in the book, and that's power. That power is really a critical barrier for ensuring or for preventing knowledge being effectively taken up into policy. And I think what's really key to emphasize is that knowledge policy linkages are not merely a technical process. They're very political in nature. So in the book we look at three types of power, drawing on a range of different social theorists. So the first one is really power as the exercise of material resources in establishing a particular policy position. The second involves negotiating institutions, norms, and conventions, so sort of drawing on Douglas North and looking at the formal and informal rules of the game and how you can best negotiate those. And then the third is really a more hidden sort of sense of power relations, drawing on Foucault, in the sense of shaping actors' very preferences and the ways in which they see the world. So a central tenet of our book that sort of helps readers to think through what these barriers might be is that knowledge producers, users, and intermediaries all need to recognize the really essentially political nature of the knowledge policy interface. I think too often we like to see ourselves as very neutral, don't want to get our hands dirty, but that's not the case. And so we need to understand these power dynamics and engage accordingly. So one example that we refer to in the book that we think illustrates this point really well is the contrast between two think tanks in the US. So one is the Brookings Institute and one is the Heritage Foundation. So the Brookings Institute is quite a liberal-oriented research organization, and the Heritage Foundation is a more economically and politically conservative grouping, sort of focused on policy research. But what's really interesting about these two think tanks is the first puts a lot of priority on rigorous research and analysis and only spends about 3% of its budget on communications, whereas the Heritage Foundation spends about 20%. And they argue that once they've done their research report, their work is really only half done. What's really key for them is to sell those ideas and sell them in a way that's politically palatable. And I don't think we would all want to advocate we have to all be like the Heritage Foundation. There are multiple pathways for research uptake. But I think what's really interesting about the Heritage Foundation is just how frank they are about this very explicitly political process they're engaged in. So we think we all have to be much more self-conscious about that and where we fit in that process. Well, I think in a nutshell, I would say really do your homework in terms of mapping out the environment in which you're working. It sounds obvious, but I think very few people do this, and this is really where we pitch the book and try and help people do their homework well. And I think what's key is we don't just rely on easy or simplistic assumptions, and we do take the time and resources to do this type of preliminary mapping before we either get engaged as either knowledge producers or users or knowledge intermediaries. And so what we try and do in the book is to work through 4 different key assumptions that people tend to make, but we think they could have a much richer and more nuanced approach to the knowledge policy interface if they were to listen and take these recommendations on board. So the first one involves political context, and our starting assumption is that people rely too much on the simplistic phrase of, oh, it's all down to political will. We argue very strongly that this is just lazy shorthand, and it's actually much more complex than that, but it's not so complex as to be impenetrable. So we talk about a number of different factors that we think cut across different types of governance types. So it's not the case, for example, that democracies are better correlated to knowledge uptake, or that in fragile states, there's no chance of having knowledge integrated into policy. So instead we say you need to think about the capacity for institutions to absorb change, what types of checks and balances there are on political participation, think through the role of informal politics, and then also think about external forces and what roles they play. So for example, transnational advocacy networks or international UN conventions, for instance. The second sort of key area that we think would really help in terms of mapping is that of actors. And here, again, there's often a sort of knee-jerk reaction that it's all down to actors' self-interests. But instead we say, yes, this can be important, but you've also got to think about actors' values and beliefs, and then also how credible they are in the particular policy area that they're working in. So an example we draw on is the work of NGOs trying to advance gender equality legislation in South Korea. And we argue that they've been very skillful in terms of tapping into mainstream policy actors' values and beliefs about the Confucian family in Korea, and then also the collective responsibility for national development and industrial development. So they managed, by doing this, to overcome deeply entrenched patriarchal values and norms and to secure the legislation. So the research that they drew on really couched demands for equal employment in terms of maximizing women's human resources, and then demands for paid maternity leave in terms of women's right to healthy motherhood. So that's just one example we draw on. Then the third key area to map out is really the relative weight or the relative importance in a particular policy area of different types of knowledge. So we look at 3 different types of knowledge, whether it's research-based, informed by programming, which we call practice-informed, or citizen-derived. And it's definitely true that in some areas of development policy, then rigorous research, academic research, is really key. And here you might have heard about debates about randomized control trials and research derived from those. And clearly in some areas of development policy, that will be very persuasive. But in others, we think it's key to understand what sort of knowledge is most needed for the particular policy area, but also stage in the policy process, whether it's developing an initial policy plan or policy evaluation. And so one example we talk about in the book is the example of RCTs in shaping the emergence of social protection or cash transfer programs in Latin America. So in Mexico, for example, technocrats were very powerful in shaping social policy, and so these randomized control trials made a huge difference. But in others, quite often, leaders need to be persuaded that citizens are going to see the state as more legitimate if they invest in such programs, and therefore participatory, grassroots-based information might be much more effective. So that's just one small example we talk about. And then finally, the fourth area that we urge readers to think more carefully about and map through is the possible range of knowledge interaction processes. What we really want to argue to everyone is that knowledge intermediary work is not just for people who self-identify as knowledge intermediaries. Everyone can be involved, whether they're knowledge users or producers. I think that's a really important point we make in the book. And at the same time, we need to think through what type of knowledge interaction we're best suited to get involved in, whether it's just informing, so letting people know about our research through a range of, say, social media outlets, or whether it's more about matchmaking, so networking, trying to bring the best set of experts together to hash out a particular policy problem, or collaborating, so sort of strengthening and formalizing relations through, say, memorandum of understanding or communities of practice. So these are really the 4 areas that we try to help you think through your homework, and we hope that the book will really set you up on your way to undertaking a much more systematic and thought-through approach to the knowledge policy interface. Whether you're a researcher, a student, a donor, a knowledge user, or a practitioner.